This week on Oklahoma Horizon. Well, we are on the road in Claremore, Oklahoma, where I take a look at one of my favorite Americans, Will Rogers. We will take a look at the political impact that Will Rogers had on his day, and it carries on even today.
We'll hold the distinction of being the only nation in the history of the world that ever went to the poorhouse in an automobile.
Courtney Dehoff will take us around the Will Rogers Museum.
But he was just a common man that became well known throughout. People loved him. People wanted to be like him. People quoted him.
We'll look at an annual event that honors Will's love of aviation.
It's a good excuse to fly somewhere and have some fun. It's a beautiful day for it.
And I sit down with an Oklahoman who strives to keep Will Rogers' legacy alive.
He is the American common man at its best.
Stay with us for Oklahoma Horizon.
Oklahoma Horizon is made possible by the Oklahoma Department of Career and Technology Education.
Oklahoma's investment in Career Tech provides more than nationally recognized technology education and training. It produces solid financial returns for the state's economic future. Oklahoma Career Tech, elevating our economy.
And the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping good people grow good things. And now, here's your host, Rob McClendon.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rob McClendon. Thanks for joining us. Well, we are coming to you today from the grand foyer of the Will Rogers Museum in beautiful Claremore, Oklahoma. Now, if the statue behind me looks familiar, that's because this iconic figure also stands in front of the U.S. House of Representatives in our nation's capital. And legend has it, before every State of the Union address, the president will come by and rub the statue for good luck. Now, Mr. Rogers' political influence certainly was even greater during his lifetime, and it is the subject of a new documentary on PBS. In the 1920s and 30s, there was no one more popular than Will Rogers. A star of both stage and screen, the Oklahoma native was also a prolific writer and a coveted speaker.
I haven't welcomed the governors. I want to welcome them too, because that's one thing we do in California is welcome. We'll welcome anything that'll come here.
Often referred to as the most trusted man in America,
I'm an amateur. And the thing about my jokes is they don't hurt anybody. You can take them or leave them. You know what I mean?
Will Rogers became the voice of the people and increasingly politically influential.
I knew he was big, but I did not realize that Will Rogers literally was the first superstar of America.
Tim Yoder is the producer of the public TV documentary, Will Rogers and Politics. An in-depth look at the influence the plain-talking, rope-twirling Cherokee cowboy had on America during one of our most difficult times.
When he spoke, millions upon millions of Americans listened to what he had to say. He generally had a way of cutting through all the bull, all the gobbledygook, all the political speak to make it a very simple message. And by doing that, he was like the inventor of the soundbite, basically. And over great masses understood what he's saying, and they listened to him.
He didn't do nothing, but that's what we wanted done.
Widely read, widely traveled, and highly opinionated, politicians of all stripes courted Rogers' favor. But in the midst of his booming career, our country sank into the Great Depression, and Rogers' commentary began to reflect the hard times all around him.
The only problem that confronts this country today is that at least 7 million people are out of work. That's our only problem. There is no other one before us at all.
In a speech known as Beans, Bacon, and Limousines, Rogers shared the national radio stage with the President of the United States. Yet it's Rogers' words we still remember today.
Here we are in a country with more wheat and more corn and more money in the bank and more cotton, more everything in the world. There's not a product that you can name that we haven't got more of it than any country ever had in the face of the earth. And yet we've got people starving.
And Rogers' words were more than rhetoric. He put his money where his mouth was, paying his own way, on Red Cross relief tours across Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, raising over $220,000 in the depth of the Depression. So what do you think Mr. Rogers would think about today's political climate?
I think he would love it and probably hate it. The rhetoric has gotten so steeped and angry and almost vicious, but where he would love it is I think he would find so much in there that he could come in with his manner of doing things and change the way people think and feel about politics. Matter of fact, if he was around right now, I think we'd have a much more genteel political system. I think people would think twice before they spoke.
Because he would skewer them? when they said something tough, yeah.
Well, but he'd do it with a smile on his face, and you'd smile too.
3 different times over a decade, Democrats tried to get Rogers on their national ticket, but Rogers always resisted with the same wit and charm Americans had grown to love since his days twirling a rope.
This is my first crack at a political speech, and I hope it flops. I don't want it to get over. If it did, it might lead me into politics, and up to now I have tried to live honest.
Now, since its release, Will Rogers and American Politics has won all sorts of awards for RSU Public Television. And I was able to visit with Dan Scheidel, the station's general manager. Why did you decide to focus on Will Rogers?
Well, the Will Rogers Museum was just right across the street from RSU Public Television, so it was an easy choice. The other thing is that a number of people in our community advisory board and our viewers were looking for content such as the documentary that we produced. And so we were talking to our community advisory board, and we said, if we're going to do something on Will, it needs to be something different than what's already been done. We have to do something different. Otherwise, why should we do it? And so they said, well, what about his political influences on America and American politics? And we said, okay, we'll do some research. So we did, and we developed the show from there, and it took on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. And you've gotten great response.
Great reviews, great response. It just exceeded our expectations. Will Rogers American Politics was a documentary that went far beyond what we all expected, and we've won a number of international, national, regional awards, everything from Emmys to Cinnies to, Tellys to fill in the blank. And our production team just did an awesome job on it. Had a good writer on it, and that really makes a big difference. And of course, Steve Gregert and the museum have been great to work with.
Now, Will Rogers is famous for saying that he actually never told a joke. All he did was watch government and report the facts. When we come back, we will take a closer look at the Will Rogers Museum.
You're watching Oklahoma Horizon, featuring some of the good things that are happening in the great state of Oklahoma.
Now, after Will Rogers' tragic death in a plane crash in Barrow, Alaska in 1935, Oklahomans wanted to do something special for its favorite son. That's why they commissioned, in the height of the Great Depression, to build this museum overlooking the beautiful green hills of northeastern Oklahoma, right here in Claremore. Our Courtney Dehoff takes us in for a closer look.
He could nail people. He could take somebody that thought they were a little too important, and he'd just bring them down the level.
1/3 humor, 1/3 humanitarian, and 1/3 heart. Will Rogers is often referred to as Oklahoma's favorite son, and the museum that has a horse-eye view over the city of Claremore honors him daily.
He became a lifetime
Andy
member
Hogan takes us
of the
on a
Red
tour
Cross, as a matter
of the
fact.
museum
But anyhow, this room here is set up. This room just
and the life of the legendary Will Rogers.
Will Rogers, of course, being born like anybody could be born right out here, he was not a poor man. Will was never a poor man, but he was common. He wanted to be common. He went out of his way to appear common. He wasn't put on. What you saw was what you got. He had millions of dollars. He helped people. He gave away millions of dollars. He was quite a philanthropist, and he was the kind that didn't want a splash made of it.
But he did make a splash in everything else he did.
He taught people to laugh at themselves. Like say, he performed in front of several presidents. He appeared at the White House, spent the night in the White House with Calvin Coolidge when he was president, and also with Franklin Roosevelt. But he could tease those people, and they realized that, you know, that he was merely teasing them. He said, I've teased the important people of the world. I've teased the big men, and the big men will take teasing. He said sometimes a little man that thinks he's kind of big don't take teasing too well.
The museum honors Will Rogers and his family on the outside, and on the inside, the wonders of the most popular entertainer of his time ropes in tourists from all around the world.
The museum now is located on 20 acres that Will bought back in 1911. He bought all the land he could. He bought land in Oklahoma. He bought land in California. He said, you know, one time, buy all the land you can. That's a good thing to spend your money on because they ain't making any more of it.
The entire world mourned when Rogers went down in a plane with fellow Oklahoman Wiley Post in Point Barrow, Alaska, a tragic death at the height of his popularity.
They climbed into the cabin of their plane, the Winnie Mae, waved a last goodbye to the many friends who had gathered to bid them Godspeed, and disappeared into northern skies. A few days later, Hollywood was stunned by news of their death.
Yet, his legacy lives on.
Still to come on Oklahoma Horizon, a conversation with Robert Henry on Will Rogers' legacy. But first, America's favorite son on stage and screen.
Now, during his day, Will Rogers was quite the celebrity. In fact, when it comes to movie box office receipts, he was the most popular actor in the nation, only trailing an actress in popularity by the name of Shirley Temple.
Will object to this digression. Now, Senator, you know, now the point is that the major...
At the time of his death, August the 15th, 1935, he ranked as the #1 male motion picture box office star in the country. An entertainer. He entertained with his rope, for example. He was the world's greatest roper at that time, and still is one that ropers today use to learn tricks and skills. And that those roping skills that he had entertain people today as they did then. He was the most widely syndicated newspaper columnist in the country. He produced 2 newspaper columns, one a daily, one a weekly. He was reaching 40 million readers a week with his newspaper columns. And at a time when the population of the country was only 120 million, 1 out of 3 people had access to his writings. And at the time of his death, he had the most highly rated Sunday evening radio program. It was both music, but most particularly the commentary of Will Rogers. And so on a Sunday evening, he was reaching a wide audience with his voice, a voice that even people like President Roosevelt, 1930s, make it certain that he tuned to his Will's broadcast just to find out what Will was having to say before he even made his own Sunday evening broadcast.
We'll hold the distinction of being the only nation in the history of the world that ever went to the poorhouse in an automobile. The potter's field are lined with greenery.
And also, Will was the most widely sought after public speaker at the time. So his popularity, his renown, his reach was extraordinary at the time, and it remains so today.
Now, if you'd like to learn more about Will Rogers, I have my full interview with Steve Graggart on our website. Just go to okhorizon.com.
If you're interested in Oklahoma culture, you can keep up with us throughout the week on the Red Dirt Chronicles blog. Look for the On the Horizon postings on Tuesdays and Fridays, and tell us what you think.
Well, if you know much about Will Rogers' life, you know that he had an extreme love of aviation. That's why each year they do an annual fly-in to his home place. Here's our Andy Barth.
They fill the skies and shuffle us from place to place. But the planes you see here aren't headed for LaGuardia or LAX. These pilots are headed for the Will Rogers and Wiley Post fly-in. And air traffic control, well, is located in the middle of a field.
So it's a good excuse to fly somewhere and have some fun. It's a beautiful day for it.
Greg Merrill is a second-generation pilot and says flying is a way of life.
My dad was a Navy fighter pilot, so I kind of grew up in aviation. I had an uncle that I worked for that was based here in Tulsa that I flew for, but it's a lifestyle for most of us.
Merrill is participating in the 76th annual event, which lands more than 90 pilots on Will Rogers' birthplace. Pilots who consider Rogers and Post heroes of the skies.
They were both aviation pioneers. You know, they were back in the days when it was truly dangerous, and they were breaking new ground when they flew. You know, they were learning how to fly. They were learning what airplanes did, and you know, so everything we know today is based on our pioneers in the future, on you know, their experimentation and their courage and their learning. So you know, we owe them a lot, really.
Oklahoma Horizon is now portable. Just subscribe to our weekly podcast. Visit iTunes.com, where you can download our show for your listening or viewing convenience.
Now, Will Rogers is often referred to as a man of all season. That's because of his varied skills. He was a trick roper, a vaudeville comedian, and then a political humorist. Now, my next guest is also a man of all season, a former Oklahoma Attorney General, then federal judge, and now a college president. Robert Henry has a great respect for Mr. Will Rogers, and he talked about it with me back in our studio. Well, Mr. Henry, Will Rogers was certainly a man of his times, but, you know, in reading his writings, it seems as if they could have been written today.
Particularly his political writings. You know, a Democrat would rather make a speech than a dollar. I belong to no organized political party. I'm a Democrat. Or the Republicans take care of big business and big business takes care of them. Or just about any profession. Banks. A bank will loan you money if you prove you don't need it. He spoke about the California legislature, and there was an ethics bill for lawyers, and he said, well, I don't think that's going to work. To work on a lawyer's ethics, you got to work on his conscience, and it's his lack of conscience that makes him a lawyer in the first place. So you're absolutely right. He was a man of the times, but he's sort of the archetypical American of the times. He is the American common man at its best. At his best.
Mm-hmm. You know, while he was certainly proud of his Native American heritage and his cowboy roots, I would have to say that he first and foremost saw himself as an American.
He did. He loved his Indian heritage. One of my favorite lines was to a group of Boston Blue Bloods in Symphony Hall, and there were all these daughters of this and daughters of that, and he said, well, my folks didn't come over on the Mayflower, but they did meet the boat. But he was just a quarter Cherokee. And it's interesting that America's greatest cowboy was an Indian. He was both a cowboy and an Indian. But he loved America. At its essence, he thought America was generous and kind, and that we needed to be that way. And he was always America at its best, I think. You have to look long and hard to find even a harsh word in Will Rogers' 2 million words that he wrote. He didn't lose his temper. He represented, I think, the best in America.
Yeah, and while he could be a pointed critic, he would always do it with maybe a pat and a smile.
Exactly. There were a couple of things that he felt deeply about that he would occasionally push a little bit. He thought religious hypocrisy was something to be avoided. He once said, if these ministerial types, if they would follow his, meaning Jesus, if they'd follow Jesus's example rather than arguing over his mode of arrival and departure, there'd be more confidence in their churches. And it's great to be great, but it's greater to be human. He really represented, again, the best, as you said, of the common man, of the common person in America.
For a man who made his living poking fun at his own homespun humor, in many ways he was probably one of our nation's greatest thinkers.
He was. Will and Ariel Durant, the historians who wrote these remarkable general works of history, invited Will Rogers to make a contribution to their living philosophers. And people, Ben Yagoda, Will's most perceptive biographer, said, this is almost funny because Will never went to college. He spent some time in the military academy. He never studied categorical imperatives of Kant or Aristotelian or Platonic philosophy, but he did have this philosophy. He was the most popular, at his death, he was the most popular male cinema figure in the movies. He was the most popular after-dinner speaker. He was the most popular radio commentator. He was the most popular newspaper columnist. H.L. Mencken, the brilliant and acerbic H.L. Mencken, was frustrated that people preferred to read Will Rogers than read his high-spun intellectual prose.
And what I think is so incredibly remarkable is he did that on a daily basis.
Will told his wife Betty one time that he was just kind of running out of material and he had to do these shows every night. And Betty said, well, Will, all you do everywhere we go is read the papers. You always get the papers, whatever they are, however many of them there are. If there's a morning paper and an afternoon paper, you get them both and you read them. She said, why don't you talk about the news? So that's where he invented this news commentary, which is the bill of fare of Jay Leno, of Johnny Carson, of David Letterman. It all got started really with Rogers, who found that he could have the news help him write his commentary every night.
But in that commentary, there were these gems of wisdom. And one of my favorites is, and I want to read it here, is liberty don't work as well in practice as it does in speeches. In many ways, he was very forgiving of our country's, warts.
He was. Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government except all the rest. And Fisher Ames, one of our early members of the House of Representatives when America was formed, used to say that that an aristocracy was like a splendid sailing ship that would sail out into the harbor, hit a rock, and sink. Democracy was like a rough-hewn raft. It will never sink, but damn it, your feet are always wet. And Rogers wouldn't have said damn it. He never used any kind of profanity, just the very mildest. There might be a darn or something like that. But he would say, yeah, your feet are always going to be wet in a democracy.
Mm-hmm. And you said he was a critic of some religious types, but he was a man of faith, was he not?
He was a Methodist. He was raised a Methodist. And he said in a famous quote, he acknowledged that he was raised a Methodist, and he said, I'm not really sure what I am now, but I've never been a non-believer. And he said, I will say that no religion is the religion. Rogers would say, hey, wait a minute, there's some room for discussion here. Let's not say that your view is the only view.
Now, I've heard you say that he is one of your two favorite Oklahomans and two favorite Americans. From his writings, what have you taken, how has it guided your life, is my question.
There is a sense of decency about Rogers, a sense of fairness. I think perhaps the greatest contribution that America has made to the law, my former profession, is this concept of due process of law, which is by and large fair. Let's be fair. Let's give everybody a hearing. Let's let them present witnesses. Let's let them have counsel. Let's give them notice of things. Rogers thought America should be fair. He thought America should be liberal in the sense of giving to people. He said, we are fundamentally kind to our own. And in the 30s, he began Hollywood philanthropy. He raised so much money. His first plane wreck, he was in several. His first plane wreck was while doing some charitable shows to raise money for relief.
Well, Mr. Henry, thank you for your time. We appreciate you being here.
I appreciate being invited.
Well, politically speaking, Oklahoma has been called the reddest state in the nation for its conservative leanings. Next time on Oklahoma Horizon, we'll open up the history books to see why Oklahoma was just as red 100 years ago, but for an entirely different reason.
But it's my belief that agrarian conservative populism is a part of Oklahoma's DNA and will be part of that forever.
An Oklahoma show for the heartland, Oklahoma Horizon. Well, that is going to wrap up our time here at the Will Rogers Museum in Claremore, Oklahoma. But before we go, a quick story. Upon Will's death, his good friend and longtime confidant, Amon G. Carter, who was at the time the publisher of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper, commissioned 3 statues of Will atop his beloved horse. Now, one of them sits here in front of the museum where Will can look over the green rolling hills of northeastern Oklahoma. Now, the second one is out front of the aptly named Will Rogers Coliseum in Fort Worth, Texas. And the third, well, it's on the Texas Tech University campus where Will is riding off into the sunset. But students there are happy to tell you the reason why it faces the way it does is where the hindquarters of the horse face their in-state rivals, Texas A&M. I'm Rob McClendon. Thanks for watching. See you back here next time.
Horizon is made possible by the Oklahoma Department of Career and Technology Education and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping good people grow good things. Thank you for watching Oklahoma Horizon.